Thanks, Marson. Really appreciate your time today. I'm wondering if you can give a background on who you are, what you do, and how can people find you if they want to track you down?
Oh, thanks so much, Ben. It's a pleasure to be here with you today. So my name is Marcin Nazaruk. Marcin is like Martin with the C instead of T, the same name, different languages. I come from Poland originally, but I've been in the UK now for over 20 years. And so my journey took me initially from psychology to organizational psychology. Then I started my practitioner doctorate with the focus on safety culture and safety leadership. And the practitioner doctorate is somewhat different from a regular PhD in the UK, because PhD is where a student sits at the uni and visits maybe a workplace to do research, whereas this was the other way around. I was full-time embedded in the company and just visited university a couple times. So that gave me unique perspective and access to a large organization. And then I moved to oil and gas for over a decade. And then now this is the 4th year of working for my company. So learningfromnormalwork.com is our website where people can learn more about what we do and contact me if they wish.
Very good. I'll show that on the screen. But yeah, I highly urge people to check out Marson's work. I love it. It's really interesting. And we'll unpack some of the stuff that he works on today. So with that being said, let's crack on to the first question. A lot of these safety systems and approaches seem to assume that if kind of nothing went wrong, the job must have been done fairly safely. I think that's a fairly common assumption. But what do they fundamentally miss about that assumption?
So I think we may look at the definition or what we think about failure and assumptions behind how failure happens. A lot of systems in large engineering organizations dominated by engineers apply thinking of working with physical objects, machinery, equipment, and engineering systems to human behavior and organizational systems. And so we've got that borrowing the assumptions. And so the assumptions may be that if something fails, it's either equipment or a human. And why human fails is because of their personal characteristics. And also they tend to assume, although I of course oversimplify, that the system is safe if people do work as prescribed, which also means that all the rules and procedures represent accurately what needs to be done and how it needs to be done. And so these assumptions then lead to the actions, and therefore, for example, a strong focus on verification. Therefore, we have audits, we have checks, behavioral observations. All those are comparisons of what we observe with the underlying or with the assumptions, with the lists of checks, right? So we have prescription of desired system in the requirements, and then we check against that. And so the learning from normal work, which is the practical applications of different aspects of safety science, including safety 2 and the work of Eric Holnagel, highlights that is not as simple. And there is natural variability to work. There are constraints, there are challenges, there are changes, and people adapt. We also see the hints of that in behavioral science as well, and behavioral systems, and in system thinking, complex adaptive systems. So what those traditional systems miss is the aspects of variability and how people adapt and deal with that variability to achieve the operational objectives in the context of resource constraints.
Very good. So you mentioned normal work. So your website, your book, you mentioned in your response, when you say that we should learn from normal work, what exactly are we looking for that maybe some of these traditional approaches seem to miss?
Excellent. So that will be the extension of what I said, because if we start with the belief that my system is well described and presented in a checklist in the audit or my requirements of how it should work, then all I do is check against it. Is this in place? Is that in place? Do you have your PPE? Do you follow this? Do you have that? Etc. There is place for verification, and there is place for that. That's fine. So I'm not being critical here. However, that's not the full picture, because if we then take the perspective from safety 2 and we recognize that there is variability, which means things change and that people adapt to it, then just checks which are typically developed in the office would not capture all that variability, could not possibly capture. And so normal work, therefore, offers a different frame, different mental model of what to look for. And so also offers techniques and tools for exploratory discovery rather than verification based discovery. So instead of saying, do you have this? We would ask, tell me about that. And then what is challenging? How do you deal with this? What do you need? So those are those techniques. And what we tend to see, therefore, is a new realm of reality that is being accessed through those tools and techniques enabled by the assumptions and the mental model of safety too. And we even recently did quantification of that, where we compared the results of our tools with the results of the EHS Gemba, which is like a checklist, list verification. And so what we were able to find is that the EHS Gemba found about 30-something% of error traps, but even then, the type of error traps focused on things which are easily visible and on the surface level. Whereas our tools were somewhere between 80 to 95% error traps, depending on the tool, but then also gave us insight into factors deeper in the system. So from training to resource constraints to people that the original checklist could not identify. And therefore, in the eyes of the leaders who apply it and explore application of it, they see immediate value. I've got those tools, they give me something, but here I've got those new set of tools and they give me so much more richness that I can act on and become more effective in managing risk.
Very good. So you mentioned a few concepts there. Now, in the past, you've drawn a distinction between hazards, constraints, and error traps. And in fact, you just mentioned constraints and error traps before. So why do these distinctions matter? And can you provide a definition for what error traps are?
Sure. So with regard to hazards, hazard is a fundamental concept in risk management and the obligatory component of probably all risk management systems, including in regulatory frameworks. And that's fine. And there will be textbook definitions. However, when we look into how this is done in practice, and now I've seen hundreds of organizations and hundreds of those, what it looks in practice, the hazard identification risk assessment, hazard tend to be a catch-all phrase that tend to include the outcomes, like the type of injury, like you can get burned, the energies, like electricity, and then everything else, including attitudes, including mindsets, like complacency, right? And so you've got that mishmash of things, which many of them are inaccurate or not helpful or not practical to act on or contribute to blaming and so on. So we've got that bucket. Now, over time, what we learned is what is helpful to drive better outcomes, more actionable outcomes, more effective for correcting for improvement, is to take the define hazards more precisely. So think of hazards as sources of energy. So energy as hazard theory, fantastic work, of course, by Matthew Hallowell and the team there. But that gives the better definition, better boundary around hazards. So thinking of hazards as either objects, energies, or substances that if our body is exposed to at a certain level of amount or force, then we've got injury. That's very helpful. And that allows also to better clarify those other things. So now we also talk about error traps and constraints. So error traps is a simpler term that tends to land better with the front line. Constraints I did introduce in the IOGP guidance on learning from normal work because I think it's helpful from the thinking standpoint. So we tend to define error traps as anything that increase the likelihood of error or non-compliance. So something that can lead to confusion or action that is different from desired. And that is also important because in practice, we have fundamental attribution error that people are affected by, and that also affects the interpretation. So when people try to interpret behavior, they naturally gravitate to saying, oh, it's the person and their character, their something about them, their brain, their personality, whatever, rather than the external conditions, right? So that's the classic. But it's real, and it have a real impact that distorts this. So also we tend to emphasize that error traps tend to be external, because even if you take things like fatigue, but fatigue, yes, is the bodily response to something, right? To workload. And now workload is driven by the organizational processes and the amounts and how the work is designed. So it's still, fatigue could be considered an outcome. So that's a simpler definition. Now, I like also the constraints. I was inspired by the theory of constraints by Eliyahu Goldratt. So in his approach, constraints refer to the bottlenecks in production systems. But we also see some of that in behavioral science. And so the constraint is something that limits the choices that people have. Because in practice, we often see leaders saying, oh, and this worker then just decided to do this, did not follow procedure and do something undesired, right? And that's it. That's the end of the story, which is not the end of the story. People make decisions within the limits of their situations, resources, and environments, right? And so the idea of constraint, that the choice is constrained by what I have in place, by my knowledge, experience, and resources available, is helpful to better understand behavior. So to oversimplify, hazards is something that may lead to injury by exposure to energy force. Error trap is something that can lead to a mistake and influence behavior. And so those two work very nicely together. And if defined well, they're very complementary, shedding light on different aspects of operational risk. And it was recognized by the Energy Institute, and we wrote the guidance for them on how to do it in practice.
Yeah, I have to admit, I urge everyone to have a look at your book and also the guidance that you published around learning from normal work. And I really like the integration with risk assessments. And I think it'll be useful if you can maybe just pick out some things that you've found that maybe don't get captured in a typical risk assessment if we look at constraints and error traps?
Yeah, absolutely. So I'll give you maybe simple example to demonstrate the idea, and then a real example from earlier this year. So a simple example is, let's say you have to work on an electric cabinet. You've got high voltage there. So the potential risk is electrification and shock, right? Because of the electricity as energy. And so you've got that as a hazard. That's energy that, if your body is exposed to, would lead to injury. But now you've got, for example, multiple cabinets next to each other, and they're completely identical. There's no labeling, there is no any visual differentiation, right? And there is a technical drawing, but the drawing on paper, the numbers is different from what is in front of you. So in front of you, you've got cabinets numbered 1, 2, 3, 4, but then on paper, you've got 3, 1, 4, 2, etc., right? Plus also when you open the cabinet, you've got different switches, and also they don't have labeling, for example, right? So in this simple example, the electricity as forces would be an example of hazard. Those other things like visual similarity, lack of labeling, which makes it easy to confuse or approach, open the wrong panel, or switch an incorrect switch, would be examples of error. And that may feel simple, but it's real, because in the UK, there was a case where 2 workers died because they approached a wrong valve, and they started working on a live valve because they confused that valve visually, even though the correct one that they supposed to be working on was isolated, was not live, had logout time, and all those processes, right? And so that case even ended up in court. So it's a real form of risk that can have real life implications. And so now practical. So this is production manufacturing environment. A company that has safety audits and gambas, and so they overall do spend a fair amount of time on the floor trying to observe and find out different issues, right? And so now they used our tools, and there was a worker who was working on a press machine. So you've got a heavy part that was pressing, right? So downward movement. And the procedure said that you had to change the tools on the press from time to time. And the procedure said that you have to isolate the machine, turn it off, right? Remove the energy from it, de-energize it, which is fine. But it turned out through that conversation that when you de-energize the machine, the press goes down. And now you cannot replace the tools or do any type of maintenance. So from the worker's perspective, you've got a dilemma. You either don't do the work, or you do the work on live machine, right? And so this type of problem was never part of the checklist, because checklists are generic. This is very contextual, related to a particular model of a particular machine in a particular area, right? Other machines did not have that problems for many reasons, right? So you've got a unique circumstance, which is coming back to the idea of variability, that you cannot possibly prescribe upfront. So it was discovered, and now it poses a very interesting questions for the leaders, because the question is, clearly there is non-compliance, or there is a mismatch between procedure and action. And now, very interesting question for leaders. Would you like to know more of those things and find out, or not? Because if you say, no, I don't want, well, that's problematic in its own sense, but then please do more punishment and disciplinary, etc., right? So that people fear you and they don't speak. But if you do want to discover this more, because only then you can address it, then the question is, what needs to happen in the relationship so that people feel safe enough to admit non-compliance? And this also takes us to the aspects of interpretation, because now you can interpret this as a violation and take action from there of some sort of punitive nature, or you can interpret it as an adaptation, figure out adaptation to what, and then act on it to remove the need for that adaptation in the first place. So these are the examples that the traditional risk assessments tend to miss, because they focus more on the physical side of things rather than systems and actions, but also lack tools and techniques to discover those things.